Are you tired of feeling stressed and suffocated by your own thoughts and emotions? It's time to unravel the root cause of your misery. Join me here as we delve into the intricacies of two of the Buddha's five aggregates, feeling and perception. These seemingly innocent aspects hold the power to create an illusion of a separate self, leading to attachment and suffering. But what if I told you these aggregates have no real existence and are merely fleeting? By recognizing this truth, we can break free from the shackles of attachment and experience a sense of liberation. It's time to peel back the veil and see the world for what it truly is. So let's first explore the aggregate called feelings or feeling tone, Vedna in Pali. In this context, the word feeling does not refer to an emotion. Often the phrase feeling tone is used to differentiate between the two. Feeling tone arises when there is a meeting of three factors: sense organ, a sense object, and sense consciousness. In Buddhist psychology, the meeting of these three creates what's called a sense impression or contact. The feeling aggregate refers to kind of the subjective experience of pleasure, pain, or neutral feelings that arise in response to a sense impression. The feeling aggregate is the second of the five aggregates, following the form or material form aggregate. According to the Buddha's teachings, feelings are the first level of mental experience that we have after a sense impression. They occur immediately and automatically after a sense impression, or also called contact. Feelings can be classified into three types: pleasant, unpleasant, or neither pleasant or unpleasant, or other words, neutral. Pleasant feelings arise in response to a sense impression that's pleasurable, such as the taste of delicious food or the feeling of a warm hug. Unpleasant feelings arise in response to a sense impression that's painful or unpleasant, such as the feeling of hunger or a headache. And neutral feelings are those that are neither pleasant nor unpleasant, such as maybe a feeling of neutrality towards the weather. Whenever there is a sense impression or contact, a feeling tone arises automatically. Every contact is immediately labeled and is built into every moment of experience, whether we like it or not. It's a subjective reaction to a sensory experience that gets mixed into everything that we encounter. We don't just hear a sound, for example. We automatically hear a sound that we like or don't care about. A sound that is good, bad, or unimportant. Sense experience is based on one of the five sense organs coming in contact with a sense object. For example, the sense organ of the ear comes in contact with a sound, and if one is consciously aware of the sound, then there's contact, a sense impression. It becomes part of your experience, your human experience. Sense consciousness is important because there could be a sound and an ear, but a person may not notice it. In Buddhism, there's also a sixth sense organ, which is called mind. In the case of the mind, the sense experience is a thought. The Buddha had a saying that all things converge on feelings. Here he's pointing to the importance of the idea of feeling tone and how it causes us to suffer. It's at the root of grasping and aversion, since once the feeling of pleasant or unpleasant automatically arises, what can come next is grasping and wanting that which is deemed pleasant and pushing away that which is deemed unpleasant. We can work with feelings, however, to see that immediately after contact, a feeling tone automatically occurs. We can see this in our meditation practice. We can learn to observe our feelings with this kind of awareness and equanimity without getting caught up in them or without reacting to them. we can notice that we have no control over what kind of feeling tone happens. We can then see that we're not the owner of these feelings. They just arise without our doing. We can also see that if there's an emotional reaction to the feeling tone, that we will suffer. Feeling by itself, in its primary state, is quite impartial when it registers an experience as pleasant, unpleasant, or indifferent. Only when emotional reaction arises from this is when suffering arises. When emotions follow, they do so with accordance with the next link of the 12 links of dependent origination. Feelings conditioned craving. If feelings are seen as appearing and then floating away like clouds, their linkage with craving and aversion will be weakened more and more until it finally is broken or disappears. Our attachments to likes and dislikes are decreased by this practice, this continuous seeing. Many times during the day, we have experiences that register a very weak feeling tone and without any emotional reaction. This should demonstrate that the stopping at bare feeling is psychologically possible, and that it could also be done intentionally with the help of mindfulness. When feelings are believed to be our feelings, they're very self-centered, and this perpetuates a sense of self, a self that craves and a self that is in control. When we place this kind of wedge of mindfulness between feeling and craving, we recognize the impermanent and selfless nature of each feeling. And this interrupts the cycle of dependent origination that rarefies and reinforces a sense of self. Here's a story to illustrate practicing with feelings. A young monk named Benny was determined to attain enlightenment. He spent many hours each day in meditation and practicing the foundations of mindfulness. One day, Benny's teacher gave him a special instruction on how to practice with this feeling aggregate. The teacher told Benny to pay close attention to his feelings throughout the day and to notice how they changed in response to different sense impressions. He told Benny to simply observe feeling tone and notice if he was getting caught up in them or reacting to them. Benny began to practice diligently, observing his feelings as they arose in to different sense impressions, such as the taste of food or the sun on his skin, or the sound of birds singing. He noticed that some feelings were pleasant, some were unpleasant, and some he was quite indifferent towards. As Benny practiced, he began to see how his feelings were linked to his thoughts and actions. He noticed that when he had pleasant feelings, he tended to cling to them and crave more of the same. He also noticed that when he had unpleasant feelings, he tended to push them away and to avoid them. Benny realized that his attachment to pleasant feelings and his aversion to unpleasant feelings were causing him distress and suffering. He saw that by clinging to pleasant feelings, he was setting himself up for a disappointment and dissatisfaction when the feelings would inevitably change. And he found that by pushing away unpleasant feelings, he was only prolonging his suffering and making it worse. With this understanding, Benny slowly began to practice letting go of his attachment to pleasant feelings and his aversion to unpleasant feelings. He learned to observe his feelings with awareness and equanimity, without getting caught up in them or reacting to them. As Benny continued to practice in this way, he began to experience a sense of inner peace and inner freedom, freedom from suffering. He realized that by understanding the nature of feeling tone and learning to let go of attachment and aversion, he was able to attain a state of inner peace and tranquility. Now let's look at the perception aggregate. Perception refers to the mental process of kind of recognizing, identifying, and classifying sense impressions. It's closely related to memory and allows the mind to recognize what forms, sounds, odors, tastes, body movements, mental objects, so that the next time a similar experience occurs, it's recognized. Perception occurs before and after feeling tone. This is important. Perception before feeling tone colors whether it's pleasant or unpleasant, and perception after feeling tone impacts any subsequent narratives or stories we have about it. A monk named Bhikkhu Bodhi states, "The characteristic of perception is the perceiving of the qualities of the object. Its function is to make a sign as a condition for perceiving it again, that this is the same, or its function is recognizing what has been previously perceived. It becomes manifest as the interpreting of the object by way of the features that have been apprehended. Its proximate cause is the object as it appears. Its procedure is compared to a carpenter's recognition of a certain kinds of wood by the marks he has made on each piece of wood." One of my teachers, Matthew Flickstein, often emphasized practicing with perception. He invited me to start looking even after the mind would label or classify an experience. Once I was aware of perceptions as they occurred, he invited me to examine the nature of the perception and try to question the accuracy and validity of the perception. He said to look at the thoughts, emotions, and other factors that surrounded the perceptions. I began to observe how the mind labels, interprets, evaluates all sense impressions, and saw how these perceptions were influenced by past experiences, by conditioning, and by cultural and societal factors. When I examined the perception process with careful mindfulness, I became aware that perception operates on the basis of previous information that's been stored in the mind. Perception kind of registers, recognizes, and labels a sensory object, received through one of the 6 sense organs, by noticing what's distinct about that object. For example, if a color, shape, or form is seen through the eye, it is recognized by the visual consciousness. It is the aggregate of perception that recognizes and labels it as a color, a shape, or a form. Similarly with sound, it's merely vibrations hitting the eardrum, but perception recognizes the sound as names it as a bird or lawnmower or whatever. Perception enables us to make sense of the world, makes the world stable, predictable, and manageable. After sense impression, there's perception, and then feeling tone automatically occurs, as we know. None of this process is under our control. We can see this directly in our practice. It's not under our control or part of the essence of what we would call a self. In our ordinary lives, perception can seem solid and true. But when we look closely at it and see its true nature, we see that it's fragile, colorless, hollow. The Buddha put it this way: form is like a lump of foam, feeling like bubbles in the water, perception like a mirage, volitional activities like a pithless banana tree, and consciousness like a magical illusion. That's from the Sunyata Nikaya 2295. One way to see this directly is by observing how often people disagree about the beauty or ugliness, deliciousness or distastefulness, pleasantness or unpleasantness of a particular item, a work of art or clothing or food or music. We can see how perceptions also change over time, or how they vary by country or culture, and change according to circumstances. Even after initially labeling occurs, there's a further thought and a perception of the nature of the object or experience. This is called papancha in Pali, which translates as proliferation or projection. Suddenly it becomes all kinds of things. It's this, it's that, it shouldn't be, it could be, it ought to be, it reminds me of this, what am I going to do about it? No matter how hard we try to get a non-filtered experience or bare experience, we will still be shaped by these perceptions of what it is. Researcher Benjamin Libet discovered that the part of the brain responsible for movement activates a quarter second before we become aware of our intention to move. This is quite shocking. He discovered that there's a quarter second before movement. This does question the notion of free will, but it also points to an opportunity. We can catch our thoughts and perceptions and act from a wiser place rather than our habitual, ingrained perceptual habits. Each one of us lives in a mind-created universe, and no two universes are the same. Although there are, some common perceptions that allow for a superficial consensus, we largely all have different perceptions and live in a separate world formed through our preconceptions, you could say. Perceptions don't give you an ultimate reality or truth. They give you a subjective readout of where you're at just in this moment. The more you observe and contemplate perceptions, the more you get a profile of the kind of tendencies that cause us to suffer or feel anxious. We can clearly see the power and malleability of our perceptions. When we see anxiety in our bodies, for example, we can ask, is there a way to hold this in a way that doesn't cause suffering? Here's another story, Vimala, in learning about perception. Vimala went to an old wise monk and asked him to teach her about the 5 aggregates of non-clinging. The monk explained to her that the 5 aggregates are the 5 factors that comprise every experience. Their form, feeling, perception, mental formations, and consciousness. He told Vimala that by understanding the 5 aggregates, she could gain insight into the nature of reality and see things as they truly are. Vimala was fascinated by this and asked the monk to give her an example of how perception, one of the aggregates, worked in daily life. The monk then told her a story. The story went as follows. There was a woman who had a perception that all men were untrustworthy. She would often find herself feeling suspicious and mistrustful of any man she came across, whether it was a friend, a colleague, or even a stranger. One day, the woman met a man who was kind and trustworthy. But her perception that all men were untrustworthy caused her to doubt his motives and question his intentions. She was so convinced of her perception that she ended up pushing him away and missed out on a potentially great friendship. In hearing this story, Vimala realized that perception was not just about seeing things as they are, but also about how we interpret and understand those things. She realized that our perceptions shape our reality and that it is important to be aware of them in order to see things clearly. I hope this talk on the aggregates of feeling, tone, and perception gave you some insight into what they are, and why they're important to understand, and how to practice both formal meditation, formal practice, and in your daily life to seeing the true nature of these two aggregates.